The autumn wind carried the scent of burning leaves across the Wisconsin prairie, but 17-year-old Catherine Whitmore felt only the chill of dread settling into her bones. She sat rigidly in the back of her uncle's wagon, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop their trembling. The rough wooden planks beneath her seemed to vibrate with each turn of the wheels, carrying her toward a future she had never chosen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Behind her, the only home she had ever known grew smaller with each passing mile. Ahead lay the town of Cedar Falls, where Augustus Thornfield waited with a marriage license and expectations that felt like chains around her throat. The white dress folded carefully in her traveling bag seemed to mock her with its pristine innocence. Costume for a play she had never auditioned for. "Straighten your shoulders, Catherine," her Aunt Millicent called from the wagon's front seat. A lady carries herself with dignity, especially on such an important day. Catherine's spine stiffened automatically, years of rigid training taking over even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Dignity. The word tasted bitter in her mouth. Was there dignity in being sold like livestock to settle a family debt? Was there honor in sacrificing herself to preserve her uncle's reputation? The wagon hit a particularly deep rut, jostling her. So hard she had to grip the sides to keep from sliding into the bags of grain that shared her space. Her uncle Jeremiah muttered something under his breath about the poor road conditions, but Catherine barely heard him. Her mind was focused on the man waiting for her in Cedar Falls, a man she had met only twice, both times under her uncle's watchful eye. Augustus Thornfield was not a cruel man, she supposed. He was simply empty. At 42, he had buried one wife already and seemed to view marriage as a business transaction rather than a union of hearts. When he looked at Catherine, she saw calculation in his pale blue eyes, as if he were assessing the value of a prize heifer. He needed a wife to manage his household and bear his children. She came with a modest dowry and the promise of competent domestic skills. The arrangement satisfied everyone except the bride herself. "Mr. Thornfield has been very patient," Millicent continued, her voice carrying the edge it always held when discussing Catherine's future. "Not every man would be so understanding about the delays. You should be grateful for his generosity." Grateful. Another word that left a sour taste. Catherine was supposed to be grateful for the privilege of marrying a man who spoke to her as if she were a particularly slow child. Grateful for the opportunity to spend her life scrubbing floors and daring children for someone who would never see her as more than a useful acquisition. The landscape around them was changing as they approached Cedar Falls. The rolling farmland gave way to more settled territory, with neat houses and well-tended gardens. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could see women hanging laundry on lines that snapped in the brisk autumn air. Normal women, living normal lives, making choices about their daily routines. The sight filled her with a longing so sharp it was almost physical pain. "There's the church steeple," Jeremiah announced, pointing ahead to where a white spire rose above the treetops. "We'll be there within the hour." Catherine's throat constricted. 1 hour. 60 minutes before her life would be permanently altered, before she would become Mrs. Augustus Thornfield and cease to exist as Catherine Whitmore. The girl who had once dreamed of traveling to distant cities, of writing poetry, of choosing her own path would disappear forever. She had tried to express her reservations to her aunt and uncle during the long weeks of preparation, but her concerns had been dismissed as pre-wedding nervousness. Young women always felt anxious before such important transitions, Millicent assured her. It was perfectly natural. Once she settled into married life, she would understand how fortunate she was to have secured such a stable future. But Catherine knew the difference between nervous anticipation and the cold certainty of impending doom. This wasn't fear of the unknown, it was fear of a future she could see all too clearly. A future of silent meals and dutiful submission, of bearing children she might never have the freedom to truly know, of watching her dreams shrivel like autumn leaves. The wagon crested a small hill, and suddenly Cedar Falls spread before them. It was larger than she had expected, with a main street lined with shops and businesses. People moved about their daily activities, and for a moment, Catherine felt a spark of hope. Perhaps in a larger community, she might find some measure of independence, some small space where she could still be herself. But then she saw the imposing brick house at the end of Elm Street, and her heart sank. Thornfield Manor, as the locals called it, dominated the residential area like a fortress. Its windows seemed to stare at her with blank indifference, and she could imagine herself trapped behind those walls, her voice growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Millicent said, following her gaze. "You'll be the mistress of one of the finest homes in the county. Think of the respect you'll command, the social position you'll hold." Catherine thought instead of the woman who had been mistress of that house before her, Augustus's first wife, Margaret, who had died in childbirth at the age of 23. The townspeople spoke of her in hushed, reverent tones, as if dying young while fulfilling her wifely duties had somehow sanctified her memory. Catherine wondered if Margaret had ever stood at those windows, looking out at the world beyond and wondering what might have been. The wagon began its descent toward the town, and with each turn of the wheels, Catherine felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the girl she had been just a year ago, before her parents. Death and the cholera epidemic had left her dependent on her uncle's charity. That girl had been full of dreams and possibilities. She had read voraciously, written secret stories in the margins of her schoolbooks, and imagined a future where she might make her own choices. But that girl had been a luxury her uncle could not afford. When Augustus Thornfield had approached him about marriage, the financial relief had been too tempting to refuse. Catherine's dowry would clear Jeremiah's debts, and her marriage would remove the burden of supporting an orphaned niece. Everyone benefited from the arrangement except the bride herself. The wagon rolled down Main Street, past the general store and the bank, past the school where children played in the yard during their afternoon recess. Catherine watched them with a mixture of longing and despair. Those children still had choices ahead of them, still had the luxury of dreams and possibilities. She was 17 years old, and already her future was carved in stone. "Remember," Millicent said, turning to face her with stern eyes, "you represent our family today. Your behavior reflects on all of us. I expect you to conduct yourself with dignity befitting a Whitmore." Catherine nodded silently, but inside her chest, something hard and cold was forming. Dignity, respect, duty. These were the words that had governed her entire life, the chains that had bound her to other people's expectations. She had been taught to be grateful, to be compliant, to accept whatever fate others chose for her. But as the wagon approached the church where Augustus waited, Catherine felt a sudden fierce rebellion kindling in her heart. She thought of Margaret Thornfield, dead at 23, and wondered if she had ever had a moment of defiance, a single instant where she had stood up and said no to the life that was crushing her. The church came into view, its white walls gleaming in the afternoon sun. A small crowd had gathered on the steps, townspeople, curious to witness the marriage of their wealthiest resident. Catherine could see Augustus among them, his tall frame unmistakable even at a distance. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who had never doubted his right to claim whatever he desired. "There he is," Millicent said with satisfaction. "Right on time as always. Such a punctual man. You'll never want reliability with Mr. Thornfield." Reliability, another word that felt like a weight around Catherine's neck. She wanted passion, adventure, the freedom to discover who she might become. Instead, she was being offered the security of a well-ordered prison. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the church, and Catherine felt her last moment of freedom slipping away. In a few minutes, she would climb down from this wagon and walk up those steps. She would speak the words that would bind her to Augustus Thornfield for the rest of her life. She would become what everyone expected her to be, a grateful, compliant wife who would never cause trouble or voice dissent. But as she sat there, feeling the weight of all those expectations pressing down on her, Catherine made a choice that would change everything. She would not go quietly into that church. She would not smile and nod and pretend that this was what she wanted. If her life was to be sacrificed for the convenience of others, at least she would make her feelings known. Augustus had approached the wagon now, his pale eyes fixed on her, with the same calculating look she remembered from their previous meetings. He was a handsome man in his way, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of bearing that commanded respect. But there was something cold about him, something that made Catherine feel as if she were being measured for a uniform rather than courted as a potential partner. "Miss Whitmore," he said formally, offering his hand to help her down from the wagon, "you look lovely today. I trust your journey was comfortable?" Catherine stared at his outstretched hand, feeling the eyes of everyone around them fixed on her. This was the moment. This was where she was supposed to smile prettily and take his hand and walk docilely toward her fate. This was where Catherine Whitmore was supposed to disappear forever. Instead, she heard herself saying, "I cannot do this." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that fell over the gathering. Augustus's hand remained extended, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something harder. The townspeople murmured among themselves, uncertain whether they had heard correctly. "I'm sorry," Augustus said, his voice carrying a note of warning. "I'm afraid I don't understand." Catherine felt strength flowing through her, as if speaking. Those 4 words had broken some invisible dam. "I cannot marry you, Mr. Thornfield. I will not marry you." The murmur of the crowd grew louder, and Catherine could hear fragments of shocked conversation. Her uncle's face had gone pale with mortification, while Millicent looked as if she might faint from the social catastrophe unfolding before her. "Catherine," Jeremiah hissed, climbing down from the wagon's front seat, "what are you doing? Stop this nonsense immediately." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But Catherine had found her voice, and it was stronger than she had ever imagined it. "Could be. It's not nonsense, Uncle. It's the truth. I do not wish to marry Mr. Thornfield. I do not wish to marry anyone who sees me as nothing more than a convenient solution to his domestic needs." Augustus's expression had hardened into something approaching fury. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the churchyard. "The arrangements have been made, the contract signed. You cannot simply change your mind at the last moment." "I never made any arrangements," Catherine replied, her chin rising with defiance. "I was never consulted about my preferences. I was simply informed that I would be married, as if I were a piece of property to be transferred from one owner to another." The crowd was growing larger now, drawn by the spectacle of a wedding that was rapidly becoming something else entirely. Catherine could see the shock on their faces, the way they looked at her as if she had suddenly sprouted wings or spoken in tongues. Women didn't behave this way. Women didn't refuse marriage to respectable men. Women didn't air their grievances in public. But Catherine was beyond caring about social conventions. The words were pouring out of her now, all the thoughts and feelings she had kept locked away for months. "I am not livestock to be sold to the highest bidder. I am not a solution to financial problems or a means to social advancement. I am a human being with thoughts and feelings and dreams of my own." "Dreams," Augustus repeated, and there was contempt in his voice now. "What dreams could a woman possibly have that marriage wouldn't fulfill? You would be mistress of a fine home, mother to my children, respected in the community. What more could you want?" "I want to choose," Catherine said simply. I want to be asked rather than told. I want to be seen as more than a collection of domestic skills and childbearing potential. I want to be valued for who I am, not for what I can provide." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every stare fixed upon her. She had crossed a line from which there was no return, had spoken words that could not be unsaid. Jeremiah stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You will apologize this instant," he said through gritted teeth. "You will take Mr. Thornfield's hand and walk into that church, or you will no longer be welcome in my home." The threat hung in the air like a physical presence. Catherine felt her resolve waver for just a moment. Without her uncle's support, she had nowhere to go, no means of survival. She was 17 years old with no money, no skills that would earn her a living, no family who would take her in after such a public disgrace. But then she looked at Augustus, saw the cold calculation returning to his eyes as he waited for her to crumble, and her determination solidified. Better to face an uncertain future than to surrender to a lifetime of gradual suffocation. "Then I am no longer welcome in your home," she said quietly. The words created a shockwave through the assembled crowd. Millicent let out a small cry of distress, while several of the townspeople began whispering more urgently among themselves. This was beyond scandalous, it was unprecedented. Augustus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a level that only she could hear. "You are making a grave mistake, Miss Whitmore. Do you have any idea what the world is like for women who reject the protection of marriage? Do you think your romantic notions will keep you warm or put food on your table?" "I would rather face uncertainty than certain misery," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Misery?" Augustus's laugh was sharp and cold. "You call comfort and security misery? You call the opportunity to fulfill your natural role misery? You are a foolish child who understands nothing about the world." "I understand enough," Catherine said. "I understand that marriage should be a partnership, not a form of ownership. I understand that love should not be a luxury, but a foundation. And I understand that I would rather risk everything than spend my life pretending to be grateful for a cage." The confrontation had drawn the attention of the entire town now. Even the children had stopped playing to watch the drama unfolding in the churchyard. Catherine could see the mixture of shock, disapproval, and curiosity on their faces. She was providing them with a story that would be told and retold for years to come. Augustus straightened to his full height. His expression shifted into something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so clearly contempt. "Very well," he said formally. "If this is your choice, then you must live with the consequences. But do not expect sympathy when you discover what those consequences entail." He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of his position and wealth. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. Miss Whitmore is clearly overcome by emotion and not thinking clearly. Perhaps it would be best if her family took her home to reconsider her decision." But Catherine was beyond reconsideration. The words had been spoken, the die cast. She had chosen her path, and there was no going back. As Augustus walked away from the wagon, his dignity intact despite the public rejection, Catherine felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. She had done it. She had said no. For the first time in her life, she had refused to be what others expected her to be. The price would be enormous. She could see it in her uncle's furious face, in the shocked expressions of the townspeople, in the way Millicent was already distancing herself as if Catherine's rebellion might be contagious. But she had spoken her truth, and no one could take that away from her. The next moments passed in a blur of angry voices and shocked exclamations. Jeremiah was beside himself with rage, alternately threatening and pleading with her to reconsider. Millicent was weeping openly, mourning the destruction of her carefully laid plans. The townspeople were beginning to disperse, but slowly, reluctant to miss any further developments in this unprecedented drama. And then, without warning, rough hands seized Catherine's arms. "Enough of this nonsense," Jeremiah snarled, his patience finally exhausted. "You want to act like a willful child? Then you'll be treated like one." Before Catherine could react, she found herself being bodily lifted from the wagon. But instead of being set gently on her feet, she was actually thrown from the wagon bed with enough force to send her tumbling to the ground several feet away. The impact drove the breath from her lungs and scraped her palms raw against the rough dirt. Her carefully pinned hair came loose, falling in dark waves around her face. The white dress she had been supposed to wear for her wedding was now stained with dust and torn at the knee. "There," Jeremiah said, his voice shaking with fury. "You want independence? You want to make your own choices? Then you can start by finding your own way home. Don't come crawling back to us when you discover what the world really thinks of ungrateful girls who don't know their place." Catherine struggled to her feet, her whole body aching from the fall. Around her, the crowd watched in stunned silence. Even by the standards of a community accustomed to harsh discipline, throwing a young woman from a wagon was shocking behavior. "Jeremiah," Millicent said uncertainty. "Perhaps we should—" "No," he cut her off sharply. "She made her choice. Now she can live with it." He climbed back onto the wagon and gathered the reins. "Get up, Millicent. We're going home, and we're going home alone." As the wagon pulled away, Catherine stood in the dusty road, watching the only family she had left abandon her without a backward glance. The townspeople were beginning to disperse as well, the entertainment over. Soon she would be alone, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the uncertain future she had chosen over the certain misery of marriage to Augustus Thornfield. But even as fear clawed at her chest and the reality of her situation began to sink in, Catherine felt something else, a fierce, bright flame of pride. She had done it. She had said no and meant it and accepted the consequences. Whatever happened next, she would face it as herself, not as someone else's idea of what she should be. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Catherine stood in the middle of the road, alone but not defeated, watching the last of the townspeople disappear into their warm, safe homes. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, no plan for survival, no clear path forward. But she was free, and for the first time in her life, that felt like enough. The first night was the hardest Catherine had ever endured. As darkness fell over Cedar Falls, she found herself huddled behind the general store, her torn dress providing little protection against the October chill. The confident defiance that had carried her through the confrontation at the church had given way to a cold, gnawing fear that seemed to seep into her very bones. She had walked the streets for hours after her uncle's wagon disappeared, searching for somewhere to shelter. But every door she approached remained firmly closed. Word of her scandalous behavior had spread through the small town like wildfire, and no respectable family would risk their reputation by harboring a girl who had publicly rejected marriage to one of their most prominent citizens. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, had actually crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. The hotel clerk had looked right through her when she inquired about lodging, as if she had become invisible the moment she defied social conventions. Even the church, where she might have expected to find Christian charity, had been locked tight when she tried the doors. Catherine pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to ignore the rumbling in her stomach. She had eaten nothing since breakfast, and the small amount of money she carried, $3.27, would not last long if she had to pay for both food and shelter. The reality of her situation was settling in with brutal clarity. She was entirely alone in a world that had no place for women without male protection. The sound of footsteps on the wooden sidewalk made her press deeper into the shadows. Two men walked past, their voices carrying clearly in the still night air. Heard she actually threw herself from the wagon, one was saying. Millicent Whitmore told my wife the girl went completely mad. Started ranting about independence. And such nonsense. Thornfield well rid of her, the other replied. Man needs a sensible wife, not some hysterical female who thinks she knows better than her betters. My Martha says the girl was always too fond of reading. Puts ideas in women's heads. Catherine bit her lip to keep from crying out in frustration. Already the story was changing, becoming something more palatable to the townspeople's sensibilities. She hadn't thrown herself from the wagon, she had been thrown by her own uncle. But the truth was less comfortable than the fiction, so the fiction would prevail. As the men's voices faded into the distance, Catherine allowed herself a moment of despair. What had she done? Her grand gesture of defiance had accomplished nothing except to leave her homeless and friendless. Augustus Thornfield would simply find another bride, one more compliant and grateful. Her uncle would pay his debt some other way. The world would continue exactly as it had before, except that Catherine Whitmore would no longer be part of it. Temperature dropped as the night deepened, and Catherine found herself shivering uncontrollably. She had grown up in comfortable circumstances, never knowing what it meant to be truly cold or hungry. Now she was discovering that physical discomfort had a way of making philosophical principles seem like luxuries she could no longer afford. A cat appeared from nowhere, a sleek tabby that rubbed against her legs with surprising friendliness. Catherine scratched behind its ears, grateful for any companionship, even from a stray animal. The cat purred and settled beside her, sharing its warmth. "At least you don't judge me," she whispered to the cat. "You don't care that I'm a fallen woman who doesn't know her place." The cat's only response was to purr louder, and Catherine felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She had been so certain that standing up for herself was the right thing to do. But right and wrong seemed like abstract concepts when you were facing the prospect of sleeping in an alley. Dawn brought no relief, only the harsh light of day to illuminate her desperate circumstances. The cat had disappeared sometime during the night, leaving Catherine alone again. She straightened her rumpled dress as best she could and tried to arrange her hair into something resembling respectability, but she knew she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had spent the night sleeping rough. The bakery was opening as she walked past, and the smell of fresh bread made her stomach clench with hunger. She had enough money to buy something to eat, but she was afraid to spend it when she didn't know where her next meal would come from after that. Catherine Whitmore. She turned to find Dr. Samuel Morrison approaching, his medical bag in hand. He was a kind man in his 50s who had attended her parents during their final illness. Of all the people in Cedar Falls, he was perhaps the only one who might show her some compassion. "Dr. Morrison," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He studied her appearance with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to diagnosing problems. "You look like you've had a difficult night. Where did you sleep?" The simple question, asked without judgment, nearly broke her composure. I found shelter," she said, unwilling to admit to sleeping behind a store like a vagrant. Dr. Morrison's expression grew concerned. "Catherine, I know what happened yesterday. The whole town is talking about it. But whatever your reasons for refusing the marriage, you can't simply wander the streets. It's not safe, and it's not sustainable. I know," she said quietly. "But I don't have anywhere else to go. My uncle made it clear that I'm no longer welcome in his home." The doctor was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with something. Finally he said, "My wife is visiting her sister in Milwaukee for the next 2 weeks. I could offer you work helping in my practice, cleaning instruments, organizing supplies, that sort of thing. It wouldn't pay much, but it would be honest. Work, and you could sleep in the spare room." Catherine felt a surge of hope so strong it made her dizzy. "Dr. Morrison, I would be so grateful. However," he continued, and his tone made her heart sink, "I'm afraid I couldn't make the arrangement permanent. My wife would never approve of having an unmarried woman living in our home, especially one who has Well, who has gained such notoriety? People would talk. The hope died as quickly as it had bloomed. 2 weeks. It would give her time to recover. To plan, but it wasn't a solution. It was merely a postponement of the inevitable. "I understand," she said. "I'm grateful for even that much kindness." Dr. Morrison looked relieved that she hadn't pressed for more. "Good, we'll start this morning. But Catherine, you need to understand something. This situation can't continue indefinitely. You'll need to make other arrangements, perhaps write to relatives in other towns, or consider reconsidering your decision about marriage." There it was, the assumption that her defiance had been a temporary aberration, a fit of female hysteria. That would pass once she faced the practical realities of life. Everyone expected her to come crawling back, to accept whatever arrangement could be made for her, grateful for any man willing to overlook her public disgrace. "I understand," she repeated, though she was far from ready to surrender her hard-won. Independence thought the work at Dr. Morrison's practice was harder than Catherine had expected. She spent her days boiling instruments, grinding herbs for medicines, and cleaning up after procedures that left her stomach churning. But it was honest work, and she found herself taking pride in doing it well. More importantly, it gave her a glimpse of a world where women could be useful beyond their domestic roles. Dr. Morrison's practice served the entire county, and Catherine met women from all walks of life: farmers' wives dealing with difficult pregnancies, mill workers suffering from injuries, elderly women whose families had no idea how to care for them. Many of them seemed surprised to find a young woman assisting the doctor, but they accepted her presence with the pragmatic tolerance of people who cared more about competent help than social conventions. On her third day, a woman named Sarah Brennan came in with a badly infected cut on her arm. She was about Catherine's age, but her hands were already roughened by hard work, and there was a weariness in her eyes that spoke of struggles Catherine was only beginning to understand. "You're the girl who refused to marry Augustus Thornfield," Sarah said matter-of-factly as Catherine helped clean her wound. "Yes," Catherine replied, bracing herself for judgment or condemnation. Instead, Sarah smiled. "Good for you. I had to marry at 16 to help my family pay their debts. My husband's not a bad man, but he's not a good one either. I've got 3 children and another on the way, and sometimes I lie awake at night wondering what my life might have been like if I'd been brave enough to say no." The conversation haunted Catherine for the rest of the day. Sarah's words reminded her that her situation, difficult as it was, still represented a form of freedom that many women never experienced. She had chosen her suffering, which made it bearable in a way that Sarah's hadn't been. But as the days passed, Catherine began to understand the true cost of her choice. It wasn't just the immediate hardship of homelessness and hunger. It was the way people looked at her now with suspicion, pity, or contempt. It was the constant awareness that she was living on borrowed time, that Dr. Morrison's charity would end soon, and she would be back on the streets with nowhere to go. More troubling was the gradual erosion of her own confidence. When she was alone at night, exhausted from the day's work, doubts crept in like shadows. Had she been foolish to throw away security for an abstract principle? Would she end up like the destitute women she had seen begging in the streets of larger cities, worn down by poverty and desperation, until they would accept any arrangement that promised survival? The answer came on her 7th night in Dr. Morrison's spare room. She was awakened by the sound of voices downstairs, the doctor speaking with someone in urgent, hushed tones. She crept to the top of the stairs and listened, her heart sinking. As she recognized the second voice, Augustus Thornfield had come to call. "Can't continue indefinitely," he was saying. "The girl is destitute and becoming a burden on the community. Surely she's learned her lesson by now." "I don't think it's a matter of lessons," Dr. Morrison replied carefully. "Catherine seems genuinely committed to her decision. She's been working hard, causing no trouble. She's been playing at working," Augustus interrupted. "Like a child." Playing house. But the game will end soon enough when you can no longer shelter her. What then? Will she become a public charge? Will she turn to other means of supporting herself? The implication hung in the air like a threat. Catherine pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. Augustus was suggesting that she would eventually be forced into prostitution, that her moral stance would ultimately lead to moral degradation. I have a proposition, Augustus continued. I'm willing to overlook this unfortunate episode and honor my original agreement with her uncle. Catherine can return to her family. We can have a quiet ceremony, and everyone can pretend this embarrassing incident never happened. I'm even prepared to be generous about the dowry situation, considering the circumstances. Catherine felt the walls closing in around her. It was a trap carefully laid. Augustus had waited just long enough for her to experience real hardship, to understand the precariousness of her position. Now he was offering her a way out, but at the cost of everything she had fought for. That's very generous, Dr. Morrison said, and Catherine could hear the relief in his voice. I'm sure Catherine will see the wisdom in accepting your offer. I hope so, Augustus replied, for her sake. The world is not kind to women who refuse to accept their proper place in it. I would hate to see her learn that lesson the hard way. After Augustus left, Catherine lay in the narrow bed staring at the ceiling. She could hear Dr. Morrison moving around downstairs, probably preparing to present Augustus's offer to her in the morning. She knew what his advice would be, that she had made her point, proved her independence, and now it was time to be practical. Time to accept the best arrangement she could get, but something in her rebelled against the idea. Not just pride, though that was part of it. It was a deeper understanding that accepting Augustus's offer now would be worse than accepting it originally. Then, she would have been a victim of circumstances. Now she would be a collaborator in her own defeat. She thought of Sarah Brennan, lying awake at night wondering what her life might have been. She thought of all the women she had met in Dr. Morrison's practice, worn down by lives they had never chosen. She thought of the girl she had been just a week ago, standing in that church and finding the courage to say no. That girl was still inside her, Catherine realized. Battered and frightened, but not broken. Not yet. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Dr. Morrison had received a letter from the county seat, requesting his services for a difficult case. A wealthy rancher named Thomas Caldwell had been injured in a riding accident, and his condition was too serious for the local doctor to handle alone. Dr. Morrison would need to leave immediately and might be gone for several weeks, I'm afraid. This puts us in an awkward position, he told Catherine over breakfast. I can't leave you here alone, it wouldn't be proper. And I can't take you with me. Perhaps ... Perhaps this is the right time to consider Mr. Thornfield's offer. Catherine nodded as if she were seriously considering it, but her mind was already working on another plan. She had 1 week before Dr. Morrison returned, and Augustus's pressure became irresistible. 1 week to find another option, another path forward. That afternoon, she made a decision that would have shocked her former self. She took the money she had earned working for Dr. Morrison, $8.50 in total, and bought supplies for a journey. A sturdy traveling bag, a warm cloak, dried food, and a small knife for protection. She also bought a train ticket to Chicago, where she had heard there were opportunities for women willing to work hard and ask few questions. She left Cedar Falls that evening, slipping away like a thief in the night. She didn't say goodbye to Dr. Morrison, who would only try to dissuade her. She didn't leave a note explaining her decision. She simply disappeared, carrying nothing but her determination to create a life on her own terms. As the train pulled away from the station, Catherine pressed her face to the window and watched the lights of Cedar Falls recede into the darkness. She was leaving behind everything familiar, every person who had ever known her, every assumption about what her life should be. She was stepping into the unknown with no guarantee of success, no safety net, no one to rely on but herself. The fear was still there, cold and sharp in her chest. But alongside it was something else, a wild, fierce exhilaration that made her feel more alive than she had ever felt before. She had said no to Augustus Thornfield. She had said no to her uncle's plans for her. She had said no to Dr. Morrison's well-meaning advice. Now she was saying yes to possibility, to adventure, to the terrifying freedom of an unwritten future. The train carried her through the night toward Chicago, toward whatever destiny awaited a young woman, brave enough to choose her own path. Behind her, Cedar Falls slept peacefully, unaware that one of its most scandalous residents had vanished into the darkness. By morning, there would be another story to tell, another example of what happened to women who refused to know their place. But Catherine Whitmore was no longer listening to those stories. She was too busy writing her own. Chicago in 1885 was a city of contradictions, gleaming steel and glass rising from muddy streets, elegant carriages sharing the roads with immigrant pushcarts, fortunes made and lost in the span of a single trading day. Catherine Whitmore stepped off the train at Union Station into a world that seemed to pulse with energy and possibility, but also with danger and uncertainty. The cacophony of sounds hit her first, the shriek of steam engines, the shouts of vendors, the clatter of wheels on cobblestones, and beneath it all, the constant murmur of thousands of voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize. The smell was equally overwhelming: coal smoke, horse manure, cooking food, and the indefinable scent of too many people living too close together. Catherine clutched her small traveling bag tighter and tried to project confidence she didn't feel. She had enough money for perhaps a week of modest lodging and meals, after which she would need to find work, any work that would keep her fed and sheltered. The plan, such as it was, seemed laughably inadequate now that she was actually here. Her first priority was finding somewhere to stay. She had heard of boarding houses that catered to working women, but as she walked through the streets near the station, she realized she had no idea how to find such places. The Chicago she had imagined from her small-town perspective bore little resemblance to the sprawling, chaotic reality surrounding her. After an hour of aimless wandering, she finally worked up the courage to ask a well-dressed woman for directions to a respectable boarding house. The woman looked her up and down with obvious suspicion, taking in Catherine's travel-stained dress and the single bag that contained all her worldly possessions. "You're not from around here," the woman said, her voice carrying a trace of German accent. "Country girl?" "Yes, ma'am." "From Wisconsin. I'm looking for work and lodging." The woman's expression softened slightly. "What kind of work? You have skills?" Catherine hesitated. The truth was, she had few skills that would be valuable in a city like Chicago. She could read and write better than most. She had some experience with bookkeeping from helping her uncle, and she had learned basic medical assistance from Dr. Morrison. But she had no formal training, no references, no connections. "I'm willing to learn," she said finally. "I'm not afraid of hard work." The woman studied her for another moment, then seemed to make a decision. "There's a boarding house on Wells Street that takes in working girls. Mrs. O'Brien runs it. She's fair, but she doesn't tolerate nonsense. Tell her Greta Hoffman sent you." Catherine thanked her profusely and hurried in the direction Greta had indicated. Wells Street turned out to be a narrow thoroughfare lined with three-story brick buildings, most of them showing signs of wear but still respectable. The boarding house was marked by a small wooden sign, "O'Brien's Residence for Working Women." Mrs. O'Brien herself answered Catherine's knock, a stout woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She listened to Catherine's carefully prepared story about coming to Chicago to find work, accepting Greta's recommendation with a non-committal grunt. "Room's 50 cents a week, paid in advance," Mrs. O'Brien said. "That includes breakfast and dinner." You keep your room clean, you're in by 9 o'clock, and you don't bring men upstairs. Break any of those rules, and you'll find yourself on the street faster than you can say, second chances. Catherine paid for her first week and was shown to a tiny room on the 3rd floor. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a hook on the wall for hanging clothes. The window looked out onto an alley, but it was clean and private. And after sleeping rough in Cedar Falls, it felt like luxury. Her first week in Chicago was a series of humbling rejections. She applied for positions at shops, restaurants, and offices, but everywhere she went, the response was the same: no experience, no references, no job. The money she had saved from working for Dr. Morrison dwindled rapidly, and she began to understand why so many young women ended up in desperate circumstances. It was on her 8th day in the city that she met the person who would change everything. She was walking through the business district, having just been turned away from yet another potential employer, when she witnessed an accident that seemed to sum up her entire experience in Chicago. A well-dressed man was stepping down from a carriage when his walking stick caught in the cobblestones. He stumbled and would have fallen if not for a quick-thinking pedestrian who caught his arm. But in the process, the Good Samaritan, a young woman about Catherine's age, was knocked off balance and tumbled into the muddy street, ruining her dress and scattering the contents of her bag. The man she had helped barely acknowledged her assistance before climbing back into his carriage and driving away. The woman sat in the mud, looking stunned and helpless, while other pedestrians stepped carefully around her as if she were an obstacle to be avoided. Catherine didn't hesitate. She waded into the street and began helping the woman gather her scattered belongings, a few coins, some papers, and what appeared to be samples of fabric. The woman looked up at her with grateful eyes. "Thank you," she said, accepting Catherine's hand to help her to her feet. "I suppose no good deed goes unpunished." She was perhaps 22, with auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and intelligent green eyes that held a mixture of frustration and resignation. Her accent was educated, but carried traces of something foreign, Irish perhaps, or Scottish. "Are you hurt?" Catherine asked, noting the way the woman favored her left ankle. "Just my pride," she replied, but Catherine could see her wince as she took a step. "Here, let me help you." Catherine slipped her arm around the woman's waist, providing support as they made their way to the sidewalk. "Is there somewhere I can take you? A doctor? Or no doctor?" the woman said quickly. "I can't afford it. I'll be fine once I get home." Catherine studied her new acquaintance more closely. The woman's dress, while well made, was several years out of fashion and had been carefully mended in places. Her shoes were worn, and her hands showed the calluses of someone who worked with them regularly. Another young woman trying to make her way in an unforgiving city. "I'm Catherine Whitmore," she said, continuing to provide support as they walked slowly down the street. "Elena Rossetti," the woman replied, "and I'm very grateful for your help. Most people would have just stepped over me. Where are you headed? I can walk with you if you'd like." Elena hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I have a small shop a few blocks from here. I'm a seamstress, or trying to be. Business has been challenging lately." They walked together through the busy streets, Catherine supporting Elena's weight and listening as her new friend explained her situation. Elena had come to Chicago from New York 2 years earlier, following the death of her parents in a tenement fire. She had learned sewing from her mother, who had worked in the garment factories, and had dreamed of opening her own shop where she could create beautiful clothes for ladies who could afford quality work. The dream was bigger than the reality, Elena said with a rueful smile. "Turns out that ladies who can afford quality work prefer to get it from established shops with reputations. New seamstresses with strange names and no connections find themselves competing for the scraps." Catherine felt a kinship with Elena's story. Here was another young woman who had taken a risk, who had chosen independence over security, and who was discovering that the world was not particularly interested in rewarding courage. Elena's shop was tucked between a bakery and a cobbler's stall on a side street that seemed to specialize in small, struggling businesses. The sign above the door read Rossetti Fine Tailoring in faded gold letters. Inside, the shop was tiny but impeccably organized, with bolts of fabric arranged by color and samples of Elena's work displayed on wooden forms. Catherine was struck by the quality of the craftsmanship. Elena's stitching was precise and elegant, her eye for color and design sophisticated. This wasn't the rough work of a factory seamstress, but the skilled artistry of someone who truly understood her craft. "This is beautiful work," Catherine said, running her fingers over a partially completed dress in deep blue silk. "Why aren't you busy every day?" Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because beautiful work doesn't matter if no one knows you exist. I've been trying to build a clientele, but it's impossible without connections. The established shops have relationships with wealthy families. They get invited to social events where they can display their work. I'm just a foreign girl with a tiny shop on a side street." Catherine studied Elena's work more carefully, an idea beginning to form in her mind. What if you had connections? What if you had someone who could help you reach the right customers? "I'd probably faint from shock," Elena said, settling into a chair behind the counter and finally allowing herself to show how much her ankle was hurting. "But I don't see how that's possible. I can't afford to advertise in the society papers. And I certainly can't afford to attend the kinds of events where I might meet potential clients." "What if you didn't have to?" Catherine said, her excitement growing as the plan took shape. "What if the clients came to you?" Elena looked at her with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Catherine paced the small shop, her mind working quickly. "I've been looking for work since I arrived in Chicago. I can't sew like you can, but I can write, I can organize. I can talk to people. What if we worked together? What if I helped you find customers while you taught me the business?" "I can't afford to pay anyone," Elena said quietly. "I'm barely making enough to keep the shop open as it is." "I'm not asking for payment," Catherine said. "I'm asking for partnership. I need to learn a trade, and you need someone who can help you grow your business. We could help each other." Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying Catherine's face. "You're serious about this?" "Completely. I don't know anything about running a business, but I'm willing to learn. And I have some ideas about how to reach customers that might not have occurred to you." "Such as?" Catherine had been thinking about this during her week of unsuccessful job hunting. The wealthy women in this city have daughters. Young women who are getting married, who need trousseau items, who want to look fashionable but don't want to wear the same dresses as their mothers. What if we specialized in serving that market? Elena's eyes lit up with interest. "Go on." "We could offer services that the established shops don't, home consultations, for instance. We could go to the customers instead of waiting for them to come to us. We could create a personal service that makes each client feel special." "That's actually brilliant," Elena said slowly. "But how would we reach these customers in the first place?" Catherine smiled. "That's where my other skills come in. I'm going to write to every ladies' magazine in the city and offer to write articles about fashion and style. I'll present myself as someone who knows the latest trends, who can help readers understand what's appropriate for different occasions. And then subtly, I'll mention that readers who want personalized service can contact Rossetti Fine Tailoring." Elena stared at her in amazement. "You think they would publish articles from someone they've never heard of?" "Not at first," Catherine admitted. "But I'll start small. I'll write letters to the editors, offer to do small pieces for free to prove my value. I'll build a reputation gradually. Meanwhile, we'll work on creating a portfolio of your best work that we can show to potential clients. And you think this will work?" "I think it's worth trying," Catherine said. "What do we have to lose?" Elena was quiet for another moment, then began to laugh. "You know what? You're right. I've been trying to build this business the conventional way for 2 years, and I'm barely surviving. Maybe it's time to try something unconventional." She stood up and extended her hand to Catherine. "Partners?" Catherine shook it firmly. "Partners." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Catherine moved out of Mrs. O'Brien's boarding house and into the tiny apartment above Elena's shop. The space was cramped but adequate, with a small kitchen and 2 narrow bedrooms. More importantly, it allowed them to work long hours without worrying about curfews or boarding house rules. Catherine threw herself into learning the business side of fashion. She studied the society pages of every newspaper in the city, learning the names of prominent families and their daughters. She read fashion magazines from New York and Paris, absorbing information about current trends and upcoming styles. She practiced writing articles about fashion, developing a voice that was authoritative but accessible. Meanwhile, Elena began teaching Catherine the basics of sewing and design. Catherine's fingers were clumsy at first, but she was a quick learner, and soon could handle simple alterations and repairs. More importantly, she developed an eye for what would appeal to their target market, young women who wanted to look fashionable but not identical to everyone else. Their first breakthrough came when Catherine successfully placed an article in Chicago Ladies Weekly, a small publication that catered to middle-class women. The article, titled "Dressing for Your Figure, A Guide for the Modern Young Lady," was practical and well-written, and it generated several letters from readers asking for more specific advice. Catherine used these letters as an opportunity to mention that she worked with a skilled seamstress who could create custom pieces for women who wanted something truly special. She carefully crafted responses that made Elena's services sound exclusive and sought after, rather than desperate. For business, the strategy worked. Their first client was Miss Margaret Lawson, the 18-year-old daughter of a successful merchant. She wanted a dress for her debut at a society ball, something that would make her stand out without being inappropriate. Catherine consulted with her about style and color, while Elena created a design that was both fashionable and flattering. The dress was a triumph. Margaret looked stunning at the ball, and several other young women asked who had made her gown. Word began to spread through the tight-knit community of Chicago's social elite that there was a new seamstress in town, one who understood how to make young women look their best. Within a month, Elena and Catherine had more work than they could handle. They were creating gowns for debutantes, wedding dresses for young brides, and fashionable day dresses for women who wanted to look stylish without following every trend slavishly. But success brought its own challenges. The established shops in the city began to take notice of their growing reputation, and not all of them were pleased by the competition. Catherine began hearing whispers about the foreign seamstress and her unknown partner who were stealing customers from businesses that had been serving Chicago's elite for decades. The whispers turned to direct confrontation when Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, the proprietor of the city's most prestigious dress shop, paid them a visit. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested she was not accustomed to being challenged. "I understand. You've been making quite a name for yourselves," she said, looking around Elena's shop with obvious disdain. "Building a clientele among some of our city's most prominent families. We're grateful for the business," Elena said carefully. "We try to provide quality work and good service." "Quality work," Mrs. Thornton repeated, from a girl who learned her trade in the tenements of New York, and service from someone who appeared in this city with no background, no references, no connections. "I find it curious that you've been so successful so quickly." Catherine felt her temper flare, but she kept her voice level. "We've been successful because we offer something different. We don't expect our clients to conform to our vision of what they should wear. We work with them to create something uniquely theirs." Mrs. Thornton's smile was cold. How modern of you. But I wonder if your clients would be quite so enthusiastic if they knew more about your backgrounds. If they knew, for instance, that you're a runaway who fled her family and an arranged marriage." Catherine's blood turned to ice. Somehow Mrs. Thornton had learned about her past. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you? I have friends in many cities, Miss Whitmore. Friends who write letters about interesting gossip. Such as the story of a young woman who created quite a scandal in Cedar Falls by refusing to marry a respectable man. A woman who then disappeared into the night, leaving behind debts and damaged reputations." Elena stepped forward protectively. "Whatever Catherine's past, it has nothing to do with our business here, doesn't it?" Mrs. Thornton said. "I wonder what the mothers of your young clients would think if they knew they were entrusting their daughters to a woman of questionable moral character. A woman who ran away rather than fulfill her obligations to her family." The threat was clear. Mrs. Thornton could destroy their business with a few well-placed words to the right people. Catherine's past, which she had thought safely buried, had followed her to Chicago and now threatened to destroy everything she and Elena had built together. But instead of crumbling under the pressure, Catherine felt something harden inside her. She had faced this kind of intimidation before, and she had survived it. She would survive it again. "You're right," she said quietly. "I did run away rather than marry a man I didn't love. I chose uncertainty over security, independence over comfort. And I would make the same choice again, because I believe that women deserve to have choices about their own lives." Mrs. Thornton's eyes narrowed. "How noble. But nobility doesn't pay the bills, Miss Whitmore. I'm offering you a chance to avoid unpleasantness. Close your shop, leave Chicago, and I'll say nothing about your past. Refuse, and I'll make sure every prominent family in the city knows exactly what kind of women they're dealing with." Catherine looked at Elena, who was watching the confrontation with a mixture of fear and determination. They had built something beautiful together, something that was making a real difference in their lives and the lives of their clients. She wouldn't let it be destroyed by threats and intimidation. "Thank you for the warning," Catherine said. "But we'll take our chances." Mrs. Thornton's expression turned venomous. "You'll regret this decision, Miss Whitmore. Both of you will." After she left, Elena and Catherine sat in the shop, contemplating the challenge ahead. They had an enemy, now one with resources and connections that could make their lives very difficult. But they also had something Mrs. Thornton didn't: each other, and the unshakable belief that they were building something worth fighting for. "Are you sure about this?" Elena asked. "She could destroy us." Catherine thought about the girl she had been in Cedar Falls, terrified and alone, facing down Augustus Thornfield and her uncle's anger. She thought about the nights she had spent sleeping behind buildings, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. She thought about all the women who had never had the chance to choose their own paths. "Let her try," Catherine said. "We've come too far to surrender now." Mrs. Adelaide Thornton's threat proved to be more than empty words. Within days of her visit to Elena's shop, Catherine and Elena began noticing subtle changes in their business environment. Clients who had scheduled appointments suddenly canceled without explanation. The porter who delivered their fabric shipments became evasive about delivery times. Most troubling of all, the editor of Chicago Ladies Weekly stopped responding to Catherine's letters about future articles. The first direct blow came when Miss Margaret Lawson's mother appeared at their shop unannounced, her face flushed with indignation and embarrassment. "I'm here to collect my daughter's dress," Mrs. Lawson announced without preamble. "The one you're currently working on for her engagement party." Elena looked up from the intricate beadwork she was adding to the gown's bodice. "Of course, Mrs. Lawson, though I should mention that it's not quite finished. We still need to complete the final fitting." "There will be no final fitting," Mrs. Lawson interrupted. "I've decided to take my daughter's business elsewhere. You may keep whatever payment you've already received as compensation for your time." Catherine emerged from the back room where she had been working on correspondence. "Mrs. Lawson, is there something wrong with the dress?" "If you're not satisfied with our work, the dress is perfectly adequate," Mrs. Lawson replied stiffly. "However, I've recently learned some disturbing information about the character of the women my daughter has been associating with. I cannot in good conscience continue to patronize an establishment run by someone of questionable moral standing." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. Mrs. Thornton had made good on her threat, spreading Catherine's story through the network of society matrons who controlled Chicago's social hierarchy. The carefully crafted reputation they had built over months was crumbling in a matter of days. "I see," Catherine said quietly. "And what exactly have you heard about my character?" Mrs. Lawson's cheeks reddened further. "I think you know perfectly well what I'm referring to. A young woman who would abandon her family and reject a respectable marriage proposal is not someone I want influencing my daughter's choices about fashion or anything else." Elena stepped forward, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Mrs. Lawson, Catherine's personal history has no bearing on the quality of our work or our professionalism. Your daughter loved her dress, and we've provided excellent service. From a woman who runs away from her responsibilities," Mrs. Lawson snapped. "What kind of example is that for an impressionable young girl? I won't have my daughter exposed to such modern notions about women's proper roles." She left with the unfinished dress, leaving Catherine and Elena staring at each other in stunned silence. It was the beginning of what would become a systematic campaign to destroy their business. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated itself with devastating regularity. Clients canceled orders, often citing vague concerns about suitability or family values. The few who remained loyal did so quietly, almost apologetically, as if they were embarrassed to be associated with Catherine and Elena's shop. More concerning were the rumors that began circulating about Elena as well. Word spread that she was foreign and unconventional, that she had strange ideas about women's fashion that might corrupt the moral sensibilities of proper young ladies. The fact that she was unmarried and living with another unmarried woman was cited as evidence of her suspicious character. Catherine watched her friend and partner struggle with the mounting pressure. Elena had worked for years to build her reputation as a skilled seamstress, and seeing it destroyed by gossip and innuendo was almost more than she could bear. "Maybe we should consider closing the shop," Elena said one evening as they sat in their apartment above the store, reviewing their dwindling finances. "I could find work in one of the larger dress shops, even if it means going back to doing alterations and simple repairs." "And what about me?" Catherine asked. "Do you think any of those shops would hire someone with my reputation?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "You could leave Chicago. Go somewhere else, start over with a clean slate. Mrs. Thornton's influence doesn't extend everywhere." The suggestion hung between them like a challenge. Catherine had run away once before when faced with impossible circumstances. It would be easy to do it again, to disappear into the vast American landscape and reinvent herself somewhere new. But the thought of abandoning Elena, of letting Mrs. Thornton's campaign of destruction succeed, filled her with a fury that surprised her with its intensity. "I'm not running away again," Catherine said firmly. "We built something here, Elena, something good and honest and valuable. I won't let a bitter old woman destroy it just because she's threatened by competition. But what can we do? She has resources we don't have, connections we can't match. She's winning, Catherine. Our business is dying." Catherine stood up and began pacing their small living room, her mind working furiously. "Then we need to change the game. We need to stop playing by her rules and start playing by ours." "What do you mean?" "I mean we need to go directly to the people who matter, not the society matrons who control the purse strings, but the young women who actually wear the clothes. We need to make them want what we're offering so badly that they'll fight for the right to shop with us." Elena looked skeptical. "How do we do that?" We can't even get our articles published anymore." Catherine smiled grimly. "Then we'll publish them ourselves." The idea had been forming in her mind for days. If the established publications wouldn't print her work, she would create her own publication. A newsletter specifically for young women, filled with fashion advice, social commentary, and stories that spoke to their experiences rather than their mother's expectations. "You want to start a magazine?" Elena asked incredulously. "Not a magazine." "Exactly. Something smaller, more personal. A newsletter that we can distribute directly to the women who matter to our business. Something that presents our point of view without having to go through editors who might be influenced by Mrs. Thornton." Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering the proposal. "It would cost money we don't have." "Not much," Catherine said. "We can start small, print it ourselves, distribute it by hand. The important thing is to get our message out there, to show people that there's another way to think about fashion and women's roles. And what would our message be?" Catherine had been thinking about this question for weeks. That fashion should be about expressing individuality, not conforming to other people's expectations. That women should choose clothes that make them feel confident and beautiful, not just appropriate. That there's nothing wrong with wanting to look stylish and intelligent at the same time. "Those are dangerous ideas," Elena said softly. "The kind of ideas that got you in trouble in the first place." "Exactly," Catherine replied. "And that's why they need to be said." They spent the next week planning their publication, which Catherine decided to call The Modern Miss, A Guide to Fashion and Independent Living. The title was deliberately provocative, designed to appeal to young women who felt constrained by traditional expectations. The first issue was 4 pages long, printed on cheap paper at a small press run by a sympathetic immigrant printer who appreciated their entrepreneurial spirit. Catherine wrote articles about seasonal fashion trends, proper etiquette for working women, and the importance of developing one's own sense of style. Elena contributed technical advice about fabrics and construction, making the information practical, as well as aspirational. But the real power of the publication was in its underlying message. Every article, every piece of advice, every fashion tip was infused with the radical notion that women deserve to make their own choices about their appearance and their lives. Catherine wrote about the importance of being economically independent, about the value of female friendship and support, about the need to question traditional assumptions about women's roles. They distributed the first issue themselves, standing on street corners and outside shops frequented by young women. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Young women stopped to read the newsletter on the spot, discussing its contents with friends, asking when the next issue would be available. More importantly, the publication began attracting attention from women who had never heard of Elena's shop before. Working women who made their own clothes came looking for advice and materials. Young wives who wanted to look fashionable on limited budgets sought out Elena's services. Even some of the daughters of wealthy families began stopping by, drawn by the newsletter's promise of fashion advice that didn't treat them like helpless children. The success of The Modern Miss did not go unnoticed by Mrs. Thornton. She appeared at their shop again, this time accompanied by a stern-looking man in an expensive suit. "Miss Whitmore," she said without preamble, "I'd like you to meet Mr. Harrison Webb, one of Chicago's most prominent attorneys. Mr. Webb has some concerns about your recent publishing venture." Catherine felt her stomach drop, but she kept her expression neutral. "Good afternoon, Mr. Webb. What can I do for you?" Webb stepped forward, his manner coldly professional. "I've been retained by Mrs. Thornton and several other business owners to address what they consider to be a public nuisance. Your publication contains content that is inappropriate for young women, content that undermines proper social values, and encourages dangerous thinking." "Dangerous thinking?" Catherine repeated. "Such as?" such as the notion that women should prioritize their own desires over their family obligations, such as the idea that traditional roles are outdated and should be abandoned, such as the suggestion that women should pursue economic independence rather than seeking the protection of marriage. Catherine felt her anger rising. Are you suggesting that encouraging women to think for themselves is somehow illegal? I'm suggesting that there are laws against corrupting public morals, Webb replied smoothly. Laws that could be applied to publications that promote immoral behavior among impressionable young women. Elena stepped forward, her voice shaking with rage. There's nothing immoral about teaching women to be independent. There's nothing corrupting about encouraging them to make their own choices about their lives. That's a matter of opinion, Mrs. Thornton interjected. And in the opinion of Chicago's most respectable citizens, your publication is a dangerous influence on young women who should be learning proper domestic skills, not filling their heads with nonsense about careers and independence. Webb reached into his briefcase and withdrew a sheaf of papers. I'm prepared to file a complaint with the city authorities, alleging that your publication violates public decency standards. I'm also prepared to file a civil suit on behalf of parents who believe their daughters have been corrupted by your influence. Catherine stared at the papers, understanding that this was the escalation she had been expecting. Mrs. Thornton was no longer content with merely spreading gossip and pressuring clients. She was prepared to use the full weight of the legal system to shut down their business. However, Webb continued, my clients are prepared to be reasonable. Cease publication of your newsletter, close your shop, and leave Chicago, and no legal action will be taken. You have 1 week to consider this offer. After they left, Catherine and Elena sat in stunned silence. The threat was real and immediate. Even if they could eventually win a legal battle, the cost of defending themselves would bankrupt them long before they had a chance to prove their innocence. She's not going to stop, Elena said quietly. She's going to keep escalating until she destroys us completely. Catherine nodded, understanding that they had reached a turning point. They could surrender now, accept defeat, and disappear quietly into obscurity. Or they could fight back, knowing that the battle would be fierce and the outcome uncertain. What do you want to do? Elena asked. Catherine thought about all the young women who had stopped her on the street to talk about the newsletter, who had found something in its pages that spoke to their own dreams and frustrations. She thought about the letters they had received from readers, who felt less alone after reading about other women who refused to accept the limitations imposed on them. I want to fight, she said, but not here, not on their terms. If we're going to survive this, we need help. We need allies who understand what we're trying to accomplish. Where do we find allies like that? Catherine smiled grimly. We make them. We find other women who are tired of being told what they can and can't do, what they can and can't think, what they can and can't become. We build a network of people who believe in the same things we believe in. Over the next few days, Catherine threw herself into expanding their base of support. She reached out to other female business owners in Chicago, many of whom had faced similar challenges from established competitors. She contacted women's organizations and reform groups that were working to expand opportunities for women in education and employment. Most importantly, she began using the newsletter to build a community of readers who saw themselves as part of a larger movement. She encouraged them to share their own stories, to support other women-owned businesses, to question the assumptions they had been taught about women's proper roles. The response was overwhelming. Women from all walks of life began writing to share their experiences, their frustrations, their hopes for the future. Catherine realized that she and Elena were not alone in their struggle. There were thousands of women who were quietly fighting their own battles against the limitations society imposed on them, but success brought new dangers. Mrs. Thornton's campaign became more aggressive, more personal. Anonymous letters appeared accusing Catherine of being a communist agitator and Elena of being an immoral influence on young women. Someone threw a brick through their shop window in the middle of the night, along with a note warning them to go back where you came from. The pressure was taking its toll on both women. Elena lost weight and developed a nervous cough that wouldn't go away. Catherine found herself looking over her shoulder constantly, wondering when the next attack would come and what form it would take. The crisis came to a head when Mr. Webb made good on his threat. Catherine arrived at the shop one morning to find a notice posted on the door. By order of the Chicago Department of Public Safety, this establishment is temporarily closed, pending investigation of allegations of public nuisance and moral corruption. Elena was standing in front of the notice, tears streaming down her face. "They can't do this," she said. "We haven't done anything wrong." "They can and they have," Catherine replied, her voice tight with controlled fury. "But this isn't over. This is just the beginning." She understood now that Mrs. Thornton's campaign had moved beyond simple business competition into something more dangerous, a systematic attempt to silence anyone who challenged traditional assumptions about women's roles. The legal system, the business establishment, even the newspapers were all being mobilized to crush their small rebellion. But Catherine had learned something important during her weeks of building support among Chicago's women. She was no longer fighting alone. The network she had built was larger and more determined than she had realized, and the closure of their shop had only made them angrier and more resolved. That evening, Catherine and Elena met with a group of supporters in the back room of a sympathetic restaurant. The women who gathered there represented every level of Chicago society: wealthy reformers, working women, young wives, and unmarried professionals. What united them was a shared belief that women deserved better than the limited role society had assigned them. "They think they can intimidate us into silence," Catherine told the group. "They think that if they make an example of Elena and me, other women will be too frightened to speak up for themselves. But they're wrong. We're not going to be silenced, and we're not going to disappear." The room erupted in agreement, and Catherine felt a surge of hope. The battle was escalating, but she was no longer fighting it alone. Whatever came next, she would face it with the support of women who understood what was at stake. The war for women's independence was just beginning, and Catherine Whitmore was ready to fight it to the end. The morning Catherine and Elena were scheduled to appear in court to fight the closure of their shop, they woke to find their apartment ransacked. Drawers had been pulled out and their contents scattered across the floor. Papers were torn, personal belongings destroyed, and someone had poured ink across Elena's carefully organized fabric samples. But the real message was written in red paint across their bedroom wall: "Leave Chicago, or face the consequences." Elena stood in the doorway, her face pale with shock and fear. "They were in our home," she whispered. "They were in our bedroom while we slept." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the broken window that had apparently provided the intruder's entry. This was no longer about business competition or even legal harassment. This was about intimidation and violence, about people who were willing to escalate to any level to silence women who refused to accept their assigned roles. "We need to report this to the police," Elena said, but her voice lacked conviction. Catherine shook her head grimly. "The police won't help us. Half of them probably agree with Mrs. Thornton's position, and the other half won't want to get involved in what they see as a dispute between women." She was right. When they did report the break-in, the desk sergeant listened to their complaint with obvious skepticism. He took down their names and a basic description of the damage, but made it clear that investigating property crimes against disreputable women was not a priority for the Chicago Police Department. "Maybe you should consider the possibility that this is just the beginning," he said with a shrug. "Sometimes the best way to stay safe is to avoid making enemies in the first place." Catherine and Elena left the police station understanding that They were truly on their own. The legal system, the business establishment, and now law enforcement had all made it clear that women who challenged traditional authority could expect no protection when that authority decided to strike back. They arrived at the courthouse to find a crowd gathered outside. Catherine's heart sank as she realized that Mrs. Thornton had turned their legal hearing into a public spectacle. Reporters from several newspapers were present, along with representatives from various women's organizations, some supportive, others clearly hostile. But what struck Catherine most was the number of young women in the crowd. Many of them were holding copies of The Modern Miss, and they watched Catherine and Elena approach with expressions of support and determination. These were the readers who had found something valuable in the newsletter, women who saw Catherine's legal battle as part of their own struggle for independence. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense and formal. Judge William Hartwell, a stern man in his 60s, presided over the proceedings with the kind of rigid propriety that suggested he had already made up his mind about the case. Mr. Harrison Webb presented the city's case with polished professionalism. He argued that The Modern Miss promoted dangerous ideas that could corrupt young women and undermine the social order. He presented witnesses who testified that the newsletter encouraged unmarried women to pursue careers instead of marriage, that it promoted the radical notion that women should control their own finances, and that it generally fostered an attitude of rebellion against proper authority. Your Honor, Webb concluded, this publication represents a clear and present danger to the moral fabric of our community. It encouraged young women to reject the guidance of their parents and families, to pursue selfish ambitions instead of fulfilling their natural roles as wives and mothers. The defendants claim to be promoting women's independence, but what they are actually promoting is social chaos. Catherine listened to the testimony with growing anger. Every positive message in their newsletter was being twisted into evidence of dangerous radicalism. The simple suggestion that women should be able to support themselves financially was presented as an attack on the institution of marriage. The idea that women should have some say in choosing their own clothes was portrayed as rebellion against all forms of authority. When it was time for Catherine to present her defense, she stood before the judge with her prepared remarks, but found herself setting them aside. Instead, she spoke from the heart about what The Modern Miss really represented. Your Honor, she began, I stand before you as a woman who was once told that my only value lay in my willingness to marry a man I did not love, to surrender my dreams and aspirations for the sake of what others called duty. I was told that questioning this arrangement made me selfish and dangerous. She could see Judge Hartwell's expression hardening, but she continued, I created The Modern Miss not to destroy families or undermine society, but to give other women what I wish. I had been given the knowledge that they have choices, that they can be intelligent and independent and still be moral, valuable members of society. Miss Whitmore, the judge interrupted, this court is not interested in your personal philosophy about women's roles. We are here to determine whether your publication violates public decency standards. But that's exactly the point, Your Honor, Catherine replied. Who decides what is decent? Who determines what ideas are too dangerous for women to hear? If we say that women cannot be trusted to read about economic independence, are we not also saying that they cannot be trusted to think for themselves at all? The judge's face flushed with anger. Miss Whitmore, you will confine your remarks to the legal issues at hand, not use this courtroom as a platform for your radical ideas. Radical ideas like the notion that women are human beings with minds of their own. Catherine shot back, her composure finally cracking. Radical ideas like the belief that intelligence and independence are virtues rather than character flaws? That is enough, Judge Hartwell slammed his gavel. You are in contempt of this court. Bailiff, remove Miss Whitmore from the courtroom. But before the bailiff could move, something unexpected happened. The young women in the gallery began to stand one by one, until nearly half the courtroom was on its feet. They didn't speak or cheer, but their silent solidarity was more powerful than any words. Alina stood as well, her voice clear and strong. "Your Honor, if Catherine isn't content for believing that women deserve respect and choices, then I am. In contempt as well. We stand together." Judge Hartwell looked around the courtroom with a growing alarm. This was not the quiet, orderly proceeding he had expected. The simple case of shutting down a troublesome publication had become something larger and more dangerous, a public demonstration of female solidarity that threatened to spiral out of control. "Clear the courtroom," he ordered. "This hearing is adjourned until order can be restored." But as the bailiffs moved to enforce the judge's order, chaos erupted. The women in the gallery refused to leave quietly. Some linked arms and began singing hymns, turning the courtroom into an impromptu prayer meeting. Others began reciting passages from the modern myths, their voices rising in a chorus of defiance. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown larger and more volatile. News of the dramatic courtroom scene had spread quickly, and supporters and opponents of Catherine's cause were now facing each other in an increasingly tense standoff. Mrs. Thornton stood at the center of the opposition, her face flushed with fury as she watched her carefully orchestrated legal strategy devolve into public chaos. She had expected to crush Catherine and Elena quietly, to make an example of them that would discourage other women from similar acts of rebellion. Instead, she had created martyrs and turned a local business dispute into a symbol of women's rights. "This is what happens when women are allowed to forget their place," she declared to a reporter from the Chicago Tribune. "This chaos, this disorder, it's the inevitable result of encouraging female independence. Mark my words, this will not stand." But Catherine, standing on the courthouse steps surrounded by supporters, felt a different kind of inevitability. The battle had escalated beyond anything she had anticipated, but she realized that this was always where it was heading. The forces that had tried to control her in Cedar Falls, that had threatened her business in Chicago, that had broken into her home and destroyed her property, these were not separate incidents, but part of the same systematic effort to keep women in there assigned roles. "We're not going to be silenced," she called out to the crowd. "We're not going to disappear. We're not going to pretend that we don't deserve the same rights and opportunities as men." The crowd cheered, but Catherine could see Mrs. Thornton's supporters growing more agitated. Someone threw a rotten egg that splattered against the courthouse steps near Catherine's feet. Others began shouting epithets and threats. "Go home to your husbands," one man yelled. "Stop pretending you're men." "We don't want to be men," Catherine replied, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "We want to be full human beings with the right to make our own choices about our lives." The confrontation might have remained verbal if not for what happened next. A young woman named Sarah Collins, barely 18 years old, approached Catherine with a copy of the Modern Myths for her to sign. As she did, someone from Mrs. Thornton's group, a heavy-set man with the look of a hired thug, grabbed the newsletter from her hands and tore it to pieces. "This filth isn't fit for decent women to read," he snarled. Sarah tried to retrieve the torn pages, but the man shoved her roughly, sending her stumbling backward into the crowd. She would have fallen if not for the women around her who caught her and helped her regain her footing. The assault on Sarah was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Several women surged forward to confront the man who had pushed her, while his companions moved to support him. Suddenly, the crowd was no longer a peaceful gathering but a seething mass of people pushing, shoving, and shouting. Catherine tried to call for calm, but her voice was lost in the chaos. She saw Elena being pushed away from her by the surging crowd, saw women she had never met defending her cause with fierce determination, saw Mrs. Thornton's supporters becoming increasingly violent as they realized they were outnumbered. The police arrived in force, but instead of trying to restore order, they seemed primarily interested in arresting women who were defending themselves. Catherine watched in horror as officers dragged away supporters who had done nothing more than refuse to be intimidated. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Mrs. Thornton appeared beside Catherine, her voice venomous with satisfaction. "This chaos, this violence, this is what your independence has brought us. This violence was brought by people who would rather attack women than listen to them." Catherine replied, but she felt sick as she watched the confrontation continue to escalate. Breaking point came when one of Mrs. Thornton's hired men produced a gun. Catherine saw him raise it, saw the panic in the faces of the women around him, and realized that someone was about to die for the crime of believing that women deserved choices. Without thinking, she threw herself forward, not toward the gunman, but toward the young women who were in his line of fire. She managed to knock several of them to the ground just as the gun went off, the bullet passing through the space where they had been standing moments before. The sound of the gunshot created a moment of shocked silence, followed by screams and the sound of people running. Catherine lay on the ground, her ears ringing, watching as the crowd dispersed in all directions. The man with the gun had disappeared, but the message was clear. This was no longer a war of words and legal maneuvers. It was a war where people were willing to kill to preserve their vision of women's proper place in society. Elena appeared at Catherine's side, her face streaked with tears. "Are you hurt?" "When I heard the gun." "I'm fine," Catherine said, though she was shaking uncontrollably. "But this can't continue. Someone's going to get killed, and it's going to be because of me." "No," Elena said firmly. "It's going to be because of people who would rather commit murder than allow women to think for themselves. You didn't create this violence, Catherine. You just refused to accept it quietly." As the police continued to make arrests, targeting only the women who had been defending themselves, Catherine realized that the battle had reached a point where traditional tactics were no longer sufficient. Mrs. Thornton and her allies had shown that they were willing to use violence to maintain their control. The legal system had proven itself to be biased and corrupt. The media was portraying the women's cause as dangerous radicalism, but Catherine had also learned something important. During the chaos, she was not alone. The women who had stood with her in the courtroom, who had defended her on the courthouse steps, who had risked their own safety to support her cause, they represented something larger than any individual business dispute or legal battle. They represented the beginning of a revolution. That evening, as Catherine and Elena sat in a safe house provided by their supporters, they planned their next move. The shop was closed, their legal battle had become a public spectacle, and they had been threatened with physical violence. By any conventional measure, they had lost, but Catherine felt a strange sense of victory. The forces that had tried to crush her had revealed themselves for what they truly were: not defenders of morality and social order, but violent opponents of women's basic human rights. The mask had been pulled away, and everyone could see the true face of the system that kept women in subjugation. "What do we do now?" Elena asked. Catherine smiled grimly. "Now we take the fight to them. No more playing defense, no more trying to work within their system. We build our own system, and we make it so strong that they can't destroy it." The real battle was just beginning, and Catherine Whitmore was ready to fight it on her own terms. The gunshot that nearly killed Catherine's supporters marked the end of one chapter in her fight for women's independence, but it also marked the beginning of something entirely unexpected. News of the violence at the courthouse spread far beyond Chicago, carried by telegraph wires to newspapers across the country. What had begun as a local business dispute had become a national symbol of the struggle for women's rights. Catherine discovered this 3 days after the confrontation, when she was hiding in the basement of a sympathetic women's boarding house on the outskirts of Chicago. Elena appeared with an armload of newspapers from cities as far away as New York and San Francisco, all carrying headlines about the Chicago women's riot and the seamstress who defied society. "Look at this," Elena said, spreading the papers across the rough wooden table. The New York Herald calls you the Joan of Arc of women's independence. The San Francisco Chronicle says you represent the new American woman who refuses to be silenced. Catherine studied the headlines with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The stories were sensationalized, often inaccurate, and sometimes completely fabricated. But they all shared a common thread: the recognition that something significant had happened in Chicago, something that went beyond the specific details of her conflict with Mrs. Thornton. "Listen to this," Alina continued, reading from a letter that had arrived that morning. "It's from a women's organization in Boston. They want to invite you to speak at their annual convention. They're offering to pay your travel expenses and provide security." Catherine looked up from the newspapers. "Security? There are more like it," Elena said, indicating a stack of letters they had received through various intermediaries. "Women's groups in Philadelphia, Detroit, Cleveland, they all want to hear from you. Some of them are offering substantial speaking fees." The idea of traveling around the country giving speeches seemed surreal to Catherine. Just weeks ago, she had been struggling to keep a small seamstress shop open. Now she was being hailed as a national figure in the fight for women's rights. But the attention came with a price. The same newspapers that praised her courage also reported on Mrs. Thornton's campaign to destroy her reputation nationally. Articles appeared claiming that Catherine was a dangerous radical who wanted to destroy the American family. Religious leaders denounced her from pulpits across the country. Politicians used her as an example of what happened when women were given too much freedom. More troubling were the personal threats that began arriving daily. Letters promising violence if she continued her unnatural campaign against God's natural order. Warnings that she would meet the same fate as other women who had forgotten their place. Some of the threats were clearly from cranks and cowards, but others showed a level of organization and resources that suggested more serious opposition. "We can't stay hidden forever," Alina said one evening as they planned their next move. "These people who are supporting you, they deserve to know that you're not backing down." Catherine nodded, but she was thinking about more than just the supporters who wanted to hear her speak. The confrontation at the courthouse had shown her that the opposition to women's independence was more organized and more violent than she had realized. If she was going to continue fighting, she needed to be smarter about it. "I want to visit some of these cities," she said finally, "but not to give speeches. I want to see what other women are doing, what strategies are working, what we can learn from each other." Over the following weeks, Catherine embarked on what she privately called her education tour. Using money contributed by supporters, she traveled to cities across the Midwest and East Coast, meeting with women who were fighting their own battles for independence and equality. In Detroit, she met with female factory workers who were organizing for better wages and working conditions. These women had learned that solidarity was more powerful than individual courage, that systematic change required systematic organization. "You can't fight the bosses one at a time," explained Mary Sullivan, a organizer at a textile mill. "You have to build power that matches their power. You have to make it more expensive for them to oppose you than to give you what you want." In Cleveland, Catherine visited a women's college that had been established by a group of wealthy reformers. The president, Dr. Amanda Foster, showed her how education could be used as a tool for social change. "Every woman who graduates from this institution becomes a living argument for women's intellectual capacity," Dr. Foster explained. "We're not just teaching them mathematics and literature, we're teaching them to think critically about their role in society." In Philadelphia, she met with members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who were using moral arguments to advance women's political participation. They had learned how to frame women's rights in terms that even conservative audiences could accept. "We don't argue that women should have the same rights as men," explained Mrs. Elizabeth Parker, the local chapter president. We argue that women's natural moral superiority requires them to have a voice in public affairs. It's harder to dismiss U.S. as radicals when we're claiming to protect traditional values. Each city taught Catherine something different about the strategy and tactics of social change. But the most important lesson came from her visit to New York, where she met with a group of female journalists who had been following her story. The problem with being a symbol, explained Rebecca Morrison, a reporter for the New York Tribune, is that symbols can be manipulated by other people. Your story is being told by everyone except you. Don't you think it's time you started controlling your own narrative? The conversation sparked an idea that would transform Catherine's approach to her fight. Instead of simply reacting to attacks from opponents like Mrs. Thornton, she would proactively tell her own story, define her own message, and build her own platform. She returned to Chicago with a new plan. Rather than reopening the seamstress shop, she would establish something unprecedented: women's information and support network that would serve the entire country. It would publish materials, organize events, provide legal assistance, and connect women who were fighting similar battles in different cities. You want to start a national organization? Elena asked when Catherine explained her vision. That's ambitious and expensive. Not as expensive as you might think, Catherine replied. We have something that traditional organizations don't have: a network of women who are already committed to the cause. We don't need to build support from scratch. We just need to organize the support that already exists. The plan was audacious but practical. Catherine would use her growing reputation to raise funds and recruit members. Elena would manage the day-to-day operations, using her organizational skills to coordinate activities across multiple cities. They would start with a monthly publication that would be distributed nationally, providing news, advice, and inspiration to women who were fighting for independence. But they would also provide more concrete assistance: legal advice for women facing discrimination, job placement services for those who needed work, even emergency financial assistance for women who are being punished for their independence. We're not just going to tell women they have rights, Catherine explained to a group of potential supporters. We're going to help them exercise those rights in practical ways. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Women from across the country sent money, volunteered their time, and offered their skills. Within 2 months, the American Women's Independence League had chapters in 15 cities and a membership of over 2,000 women. The organization's first major success came when they provided legal assistance to a woman in St. Louis who was being denied custody of her children because she had left an abusive husband. The case received national attention, and when the woman won the right to keep her children, it established an important legal precedent. But the League's most significant impact was in changing the conversation about women's rights. Instead of being defensive about their demands for independence, women began to argue proactively for their full participation in society. Instead of asking for permission to work or vote or own property, they began to demand recognition of their inherent right to do so. Mrs. Thornton, meanwhile, watched these developments with growing alarm. What had begun as a simple effort to eliminate competition for her dress shop had evolved into something far more threatening: a national movement that challenged fundamental assumptions about women's roles in society. She tried to adapt her tactics to the new reality. Her lawyers filed lawsuits challenging the League's legal status. Her political allies introduced legislation that would restrict women's organizational activities. Her media contacts published articles claiming that the League was a dangerous, radical organization that threatened American family values. But Catherine had learned from her earlier mistakes. Instead of responding defensively to these attacks, she used them as opportunities to expand her message. When politicians claimed that the League was anti-family, she pointed out that many of their members were fighting for the right to protect their families from abuse and neglect. When newspapers called them radicals, She asked whether believing in women's basic human rights was really so radical. The conflict came to a head during the League's first national convention, held in Chicago 6 months after the courthouse confrontation. Over 500 women from across the country gathered to discuss strategy, share experiences, and demonstrate their solidarity. Mrs. Thornton organized a counter-convention at the same time, bringing together conservative women who opposed the League's agenda. She had hoped to show that the League represented only a small minority of American women, that most women were content with their traditional roles. But the contrast between the two gatherings was stark. Mrs. Thornton's convention was filled with wealthy, older women who spoke primarily about preserving existing social arrangements. The League's convention was diverse in age, class, and background, with participants who spoke passionately about expanding opportunities for all women. More importantly, the League's convention was forward-looking, focused on practical solutions to real problems. They discussed strategies for political organizing, shared information about legal rights, and planned coordinated actions to advance women's interests. Catherine's keynote speech at the convention was broadcast by telegram to newspapers across the country. In it, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small town in Wisconsin to the leadership of a national movement. 2 years ago, I was a young woman with no choices and no voice, she said. Today, I stand before you as proof that women can create their own choices and find their own voices. But more importantly, I stand before you as evidence that individual courage becomes collective power when women support each other. The speech was widely reprinted and discussed, but what made the convention truly significant was what happened afterward. The delegates didn't just go home inspired, they went home organized. They had concrete plans for action, specific goals to achieve, and a network of support that would sustain them through the challenges ahead. Within a year, the League had grown to over 10,000 members in more than 50 cities. They had successfully lobbied for changes in property laws in 7 states. They had established employment agencies that helped women find jobs traditionally reserved for men. They had created a legal defense fund that had won dozens of court cases establishing women's rights. But perhaps most importantly, they had changed the way women thought about themselves and their possibilities. The idea that women should be grateful for whatever roles men assigned them was giving way to the belief that women deserved to define their own roles and pursue their own goals. Elena, watching Catherine address another crowd of enthusiastic supporters, marveled at the transformation. "Do you remember when our biggest worry was whether we could afford to keep the shop open?" she asked. Catherine smiled. "Sometimes I feel like that was a different person in a different life. But then I remember that it all started with the same basic principle, the belief that women deserve to make their own choices." She looked out at the crowd of women who had come to hear her speak, women who were teachers and factory workers, mothers and spinsters, immigrants and daughters of old American families. They represented every background and circumstance, but they shared a common determination to build a world where women's intelligence, courage, and dreams were valued and respected. "The work is far from finished," Catherine continued. "We've won some battles, but the war for women's true equality is going to take generations. What we've done is prove that it's possible. We've shown that women can organize, can fight, can build institutions that serve their interests. We've demonstrated that the demand for women's independence isn't a temporary hysteria. It's a permanent part of American society." The audience applauded, but Catherine could see in their faces that they understood the challenge ahead. Changing laws and customs was difficult work that required sustained effort and strategic thinking. There would be setbacks and defeats along with victories. There would be new opponents who would find new ways to resist women's advancement, but there would also be new allies, new strategies, and new opportunities. The foundation had been laid for a movement that would continue long after Catherine and Elena were gone. The young women in the audience would carry the fight forward, and they would be better prepared for it than Catherine had been when she first said no to Augustus Thornfield. That night, as Catherine and Elena sat in their hotel room planning the next phase of their campaign, they reflected on how far they had come and how much further they had to go. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just married Augustus? Elena asked. Catherine considered the question seriously. I think I would have died, she said finally. Not physically, but spiritually. I would have become a ghost of myself, going through the motions of living without ever really being alive. And now I'm more alive than I ever imagined possible. The work is hard, the opposition is fierce, and the future is uncertain. But I'm fighting for something I believe in, surrounded by women who share that belief. I wouldn't trade this life for any other. Outside their window, the city of Chicago sprawled in all directions, filled with millions of people living their own struggles and pursuing their own dreams. Somewhere in that vast metropolis, Mrs. Thornton was probably planning her next move against the League. Somewhere else, young women were reading League publications and beginning to imagine different futures for themselves. The battle for women's independence would continue, but it would never again be fought by isolated individuals facing overwhelming odds. Catherine and Elena had helped build something larger than themselves, a movement that would endure and grow and ultimately transform American society. The work was far from finished, but the foundation was solid. And that, Catherine thought, was enough for one lifetime of fighting. 25 years after Catherine Whitmore was thrown from a wagon in Cedar Falls, Wisconsin, she stood before the largest gathering of women in American history. The year was 1910, and the National American Woman Suffrage Association had chosen her to deliver the keynote address at their annual convention in Washington, D.C. The woman who took the podium bore little resemblance to the terrified 17-year-old who had once faced down Augustus Thornfield. At 42, Catherine carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to wield power effectively. Her hair was now streaked with silver, her face lined with the marks of years spent fighting difficult battles, but her eyes held the same fierce determination that had driven her to reject a life of submission. The audience of over 3,000 women represented every state in the Union, every social class, every background imaginable. They were teachers and factory workers, society matrons and immigrant strivers, young idealists and gray-haired veterans of decades of struggle. What united them was their shared belief that women deserved full participation in American democracy. When I was 17, Catherine began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium, I believed that saying no to one man's demands was the most radical thing a woman could do. I had no idea that my small act of rebellion would become part of something so much larger than myself. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces before her. Many of these women had stories similar to hers, moments when they had chosen dignity over safety, independence over security, possibility over certainty. But unlike Catherine, they had not faced their challenges alone. The American Women's Independence League now has over 100,000 members in every state and territory. We have established schools and hospitals, founded businesses and newspapers, elected women to local offices from Maine to California. We have proven that women are not just capable of participating in public life, we are essential to it. The applause was thunderous, but Catherine raised her hand for silence. She had more to say, and the time for speaking was limited. But our greatest achievement is not in the institutions we have built or the laws we have changed. Our greatest achievement is in the transformation of how women see themselves and their possibilities. We have helped create a generation of women who do not ask permission to live their lives. They simply live them. In the front row, Elena Rossetti, now Elena Whitmore, having married Catherine's younger brother in a ceremony that had scandalized and delighted their respective families, smiled with pride. She had managed the League's operations for over 2 decades, turning Catherine's vision into a smoothly functioning organization that served women across the continent. The League had evolved far beyond its original focus on supporting individual women who challenged traditional roles. It now operated employment agencies in 50 cities, legal clinics that provided free services to women who couldn't afford attorneys, and a network of schools that offered both traditional education and practical training in trades typically reserved for men. But perhaps most significantly, the League had become a political force that could no longer be ignored. When politicians spoke about women's issues, they knew they would be held accountable by thousands of organized, informed women who were prepared to reward their friends and punish their enemies. The question we face now, Catherine continued, is not whether women deserve equal rights. We have proven that beyond any doubt. The question is whether we have the courage to claim those rights fully and use them wisely. She had been thinking about this challenge for months as she prepared her speech. The suffrage movement was gaining momentum, with several states already granting women the right to vote. But Catherine had learned that legal rights were meaningless without the social and economic power to exercise them effectively. Winning the vote is just the beginning, she said. We must ensure that women use that vote to advance not just their own interests, but the interests of all Americans who have been denied full participation in our democracy. The speech was interrupted by applause 17 times, but what made it truly significant was what happened afterward. The delegates didn't just go home inspired, they went home with concrete plans for action. They had committed to register 1 million new female voters within 2 years, to run women for office at every level of government, and to use their collective power to address the social problems that traditional politics had ignored. The convention also marked the end of Catherine's formal leadership of the League. At 42, she was ready to step back from the day-to-day management of the organization and focus on writing the definitive account of the women's independence movement. Her memoir, The Price of Freedom, A Woman's Journey from Submission to Suffrage, would be published 3 years later and become one of the most influential books of the progressive era. But more immediately, her retirement from active leadership created space for a new generation of women to take the movement in directions she had never imagined. Among them was Dr. Sarah Washington, a physician who had been inspired by Catherine's example to pursue medical training despite family opposition. Dr. Washington had used her skills to establish clinics that served working-class women, and she now advocated for the League to take on broader social justice issues. Catherine showed us that women could fight for themselves, Dr. Washington explained to a reporter. Now we need to show that women will fight for everyone who faces injustice. There was also Maria Santos, the daughter of Mexican immigrants, who had built a network of League chapters in the Southwest that addressed the specific challenges faced by women of color. Her work had forced the organization to confront its own limitations and expand its definition of women's rights. True equality means equality for all women, Santos had argued in a famous speech. Not just the ones who look like the women who founded this movement. Perhaps most remarkably, there was Jane Thornton, the granddaughter of Catherine's old nemesis, Mrs. Adelaide Thornton. Jane had grown up hearing stories about the dangerous radical who had corrupted Chicago's women. But when she came of age, she sought out Catherine's writings and became convinced that her grandmother had been on the wrong side of history. My grandmother thought she was protecting women by keeping them in their traditional roles, Jane explained in a letter to Catherine. But she was actually protecting a system that limited women's potential and denied them the chance to contribute fully to society. Jane's conversion was particularly meaningful to Catherine because it demonstrated that the movement had succeeded in changing not just laws and institutions, but hearts and minds. The daughters and granddaughters of the women who had opposed women's independence were now advocates for women's equality. The transformation was visible everywhere. In 1910, women made up 40% of college graduates, compared to less than 20% when Catherine had first challenged social expectations. Women owned and operated thousands of businesses, from small shops to major corporations. They worked as doctors, lawyers, journalists, and teachers in numbers that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. But perhaps most importantly, the idea that women should be grateful for whatever roles men assigned them had become as outdated as the notion that the earth was flat. A new generation of women grew up assuming that they could pursue any career, enter any profession, and participate fully in public life. This transformation was not without its challenges. There was still significant opposition to women's advancement, and many barriers remained in place. But the opposition was now defensive rather than offensive, fighting to preserve what they could of the old system rather than confidently asserting its rightness. Catherine saw this most clearly in her final public confrontation with the forces that had once seemed so overwhelming. In 1912, she was invited to speak at the University of Wisconsin, less than 50 miles from Cedar Falls, where her journey had begun. The invitation came from the university's new Women's Studies program, itself a testament to how much the academic world had changed. Augustus Thornfield, now in his 70s, attended the lecture. He had never remarried after Catherine's refusal, and he had spent decades watching the world change in ways that validated her choice and challenged everything he had believed about women's proper roles. After the lecture, he approached her with an expression she had never seen on his face before: uncertainty. "Miss Whitmore," he said, using her maiden name, though she had been married to a League supporter for over a decade. I wanted to apologize for my behavior all those years ago. I see now that you were right to refuse my proposal. We would have made each other miserable." Catherine studied his face, seeing genuine remorse, and perhaps even a glimmer of understanding. "Mr. Thornfield, I appreciate your apology, but I think you still don't understand what this was really about. It wasn't about whether we would have been happy together. It was about whether I had the right to choose my own happiness." He nodded slowly. "I'm beginning to understand that. My daughter, well, she's a doctor now, practicing in Milwaukee. She says things I never imagined a woman could say, does things I never imagined a woman could do. And she's magnificent." It was, Catherine thought, perhaps the most honest conversation she had ever had with him. And it symbolized the broader transformation that had taken place in American society. The men who had once confidently asserted their right to control women's lives now had to justify their positions in a world where women's capabilities were undeniable. As Catherine prepared to leave the university, she received an unexpected visitor, a young woman named Dorothy Miller, who had traveled from Cedar Falls specifically to meet her. "Miss Whitmore," Dorothy said, "I'm writing my senior thesis about the women's independence movement, and I wanted to ask you about something. In all the articles and books about your story, they focus on the dramatic moments, the confrontation at the church, the courthouse riot, the founding of the League. But I'm curious about the quiet moments. What kept you going during the times when no one was watching?" Catherine smiled, remembering her own academic ambitions from so many years ago. "What kept me going was the same thing that brought you here. Today, the belief that women's stories matter, that women's experiences are worth preserving and studying and learning from." She paused, looking out at the campus where young women and men studied together as equals. "I used to think that courage was a single moment of defiance, a dramatic gesture that changed everything. But I learned that real courage is getting up every morning and choosing to be yourself, even when the world tells you that yourself is not enough." Dorothy wrote down her words carefully, and Catherine realized that this conversation, like thousands of others happening across the country, was how the movement really survived and grew. Not through famous speeches or dramatic confrontations, but through the daily decision of individual women to support each other and refuse to accept limitations on their potential. As Catherine's train pulled away from the university, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a frightened, teenager in a wagon to a recognized leader in a movement that had transformed American society. The girl who had once believed that saying no to one man was the most radical thing a woman could do had lived to see women saying yes to possibilities that had been unimaginable in her youth. The work was far from finished. Women still faced discrimination and limitation in many areas of life. The right to vote remained elusive in many states. Economic equality was still a distant goal, but the foundation had been laid for future generations to build upon. Catherine had learned that individual courage, when amplified by collective action, could indeed change the world. She had also learned that the most important legacy was not the institutions she had built or the laws she had helped change, but the example she had set for other women to follow. As the train carried her toward her next speaking engagement, Catherine opened her journal and began writing the final chapter of her memoir. She wanted to end with the same message she had tried to convey in every speech and every article, that freedom was not a destination but a daily choice, and that every woman who chose to live authentically made it easier for other women to do the same. The ripple effect of her refusal to marry Augustus Thornfield had spread far beyond anything she could have imagined. It had become part of a wave of change that was still building, still transforming American society, still creating new possibilities for women who would never even know her name. And that, Catherine thought as she began to write, was exactly as it should be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.